Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though in battle we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself.
World War II, Korea, Vietnam. These three conflicts changed the shape of the world forever. They also represent some of the highest losses of American troops overseas. Many soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen longed for the continued brotherhood they experienced in their respective branches. To retain that experience, many re-enlisted and continued their service to our nation. One man served in all three, First Sergeant Joseph T. Martin. Sergeant Martin would become a decorated soldier before the end of World War II, earning a Silver Star at the young age of 19. The award was presented by Major General Frederick to then Private Martin on February the 10th, 1945, for his actions of November 1st, 1944. Private Martin and another soldier volunteered to retrieve an injured soldier who was missing after a tactical retreat. They were able to retrieve the injured soldier. However, the soldier would die later as a result of his numerous wounds from enemy fire. Private Martin was hailed a hero for his gallant actions under enemy fire and his attempts to save the life of a wounded comrade. Fast forward to Vietnam and you would have found First Sergeant Martin working as a combat engineer. During construction of a future airfield for American pilots, their position was attacked by the North Vietnamese Army. During the attack, Sergeant Martin reverted to his training and began ordering his men into any foxhole they could find. After ensuring his men were secure and in a position to defend themselves, he collapsed in a foxhole. First Sergeant Joseph T. Martin had suffered a myocardial infarction, otherwise known as a heart attack, and would pass away in South Vietnam. The following interview is with one of his sons, former Air Force veteran and Jonesboro, Arkansas resident Frank Martin. Listen as he talks about the heroic legacy his father left behind.
He was in World War II, he was in Korea, and killed in Vietnam. Yes. He was killed in May of 1967. I believe it was May 11th. May 11th of 1967. It was 8 days before my birthday. I was 7 years old. I turned 7.
And do you remember what his rank was in the military?
He was an E8, which is a first sergeant. That story goes like this. He enlisted. He volunteered to go into the Army. He was not of age. And he went to his stepfather and told him, I am going in to the Army. And his stepfather said, no, you're not. You're not of age and I'm not going to sign for you. And my father told him, I'm a grown man. I'll do what I want to do. And his stepfather took him behind the woodshed and they had a fist fight. And his stepfather whooped him and then signed for him to go into the Army. And that's how he went in. I do. I had the honor of, my dad would take me with him when they would go down to the Rod and Gun Club, which is like, it was on base at Fort Riley. It's where it wasn't an NCO club. It's where all the guys that hunted and fished would hang out. So you had officers and you had enlisted men. My dad being a sergeant and being through 2 wars, the only person that outranked him respect-wise would have been a full bird colonel. Everybody else saluted him first. I mean, a man with those kind of medals and that kind of commendations and the things he had been through, that was recognized by people who did not go through World War II or even Korea, who had just come in and were officers and stuff. So I can remember in particular one of the, he was a 2nd lieutenant that my dad liked. And he asked my dad, "What do you remember about basic training the most?" And my dad said, "Wanting to get out of basic training." And he said, "Was it that bad?" And he said, "If you made it through basic training, you had no fear going into war." In the Army, as well as the Navy, Marines, any branch of the service back then, they were preparing you to go into war where you, if you were shot, you would not leave the guy to your right or to your left behind. They were preparing you for the ultimate sacrifice, which was to die for your country, if you had to. They prepared you to be a man, knowing good and well you could be captured and tortured and killed by the enemy. That is something that in this day and age it's not really thought about. But back then, for a German group or the Japanese to capture an American, you were going to be tortured, and especially by the Japanese. You were going to be tortured, and if you lived through it, you'd be lucky. But they were preparing you to go through everything that the Japanese or the Germans would do to you and look at them and say, "Martin, Sergeant Martin, number 567-543-999," and say nothing else. No matter what they did to you, you gave them no information, not a word. That type of mentality meant you had to be beat on in basic training, you had to be shot at in basic training, you had to be starved in basic training, you had to learn to eat bugs, you had to learn survive. You had to learn how to survive if need be. His first days in service, if I remember correctly, he didn't, it wasn't combat right off the bat. It was, I think he went into, for the first little bit, it was military police or the guard of some kind. I forget what they called it. And he was stationed in California and Nebraska, a few other places like that before he went in. And it was, they were moving guys around, getting them ready to be shipped overseas. So he loved the military because it was a disciplined atmosphere. They woke you up. They fed you. Everything was regimented. It was, you do it by the book this way. And that's the type of person he was. It didn't matter. You went by the book. If your sergeant told you to stand on one leg and crow like a rooster, that's what he did. Didn't question it. He did exactly what he was ordered to do. And that was the type of personality he had.
A man of integrity.
Man of integrity, a man of courage, and a man of honor. And back then in the 40s, 30s and 40s, all a man had was his word and his integrity. You know, that's all a man had. So different time than today. He loved his country. He loved it more than anything else. And at that time, he didn't have a high school education. There was very little of an opportunity for a man then, without any kind of really education, to make his way. And it was, I believe, him and some of his buddies had just decided, let's go into the Army. Let's fight for our country. So they all enlisted together and went in. It was a matter of being tough, and in that day and age, if you were a man, you were expected to be a tough man. And that's just the way boys were raised. So being tough and doing something that other guys could not do was what, you know, he wanted to do that. Young man at 17 years of age, and he was going to show the world, and especially his stepfather, that he was a man. So, you know, military, going through boot camp, that was the way to do it. I was born in Germany, at Frankfurt, in Frankfurt, Germany, and we came back to the States. I spent all of my time at Fort Riley, at Fort Riley, Kansas. I can remember him being deployed to Florida for training. Probably the scariest, for me as a little boy, the scariest deployment I remember him having was when the tornado hit Topeka, Kansas. 73 miles down I-70. If I remember correctly, 2 or 3 tornadoes hit the capital. And they called for the military right away. And being that he was in the engineers, heavy equipment, everything, they went. And I can remember, because it was a storm, and there were people that had lost their lives, and it was on the news, and now I knew my father was going. That was scary for me. Even though the storm was over and they were doing the cleanup, it was a big thing for me, because it was, you know, that's my dad. You know, they called him to do that. I remember him being, like I said, to Florida, and he also went, before Vietnam, into Texas one time, being deployed there, getting ready to take his men to Vietnam. My dad started the 595th Engineering Battalion, and they had a mascot, and the mascot's name was Lee Jr. And Lee Jr. was a corporal in the United States Army, and Lee Jr. was a donkey. And he had to go get that donkey to bring him up as the mascot. Anybody with a rank below corporal, when you walked by Lee Jr.'s stable, if he was there, if you didn't salute him, my dad would stop you and make you salute that donkey. Yes, sir. I remember that vividly because I was able to give carrots to the donkey and pet the donkey. And it was my dad's donkey. When the last time I saw my father alive, the train was coming through Chapman, Kansas, where we were living. And my family and most of the town was down on the street where the train went by. And of course, we were all standing there, and the train's going by, and we could see, and it wasn't going by very fast, and we could see the men's faces in the windows, and they were all looking out and waving at us as we were waving at them. And in the last car before the caboose was the car that the donkey was in, and my dad had his arm around that donkey's neck, and he was waving at us as they went by. I've got a picture, I hope my brother will send it, of him. He was on the back cover of Army Times that said immovable object meets immovable object, and it was Lee Jr. with the 595th blanket over his back in Vietnam kissing my dad. And my dad was reached over kissing him, and that was right before he was killed, right before he died. I remember him telling the story of them parachuting out over North Africa. And it was, the way he explained it was, you didn't look to the left or to the right as you were coming down, because you didn't want to see the guy to the left or to the right die before he ever hit the ground. Because they shot up as you're falling, they were shooting up at you. So you always looked, he said you would just look down and try to pick the best place to land. And, you know, once you land, of course, you'd ball up your chute and get everything ready and make sure everybody else was ready and, you know, deploy from there. He was not a type of person who had didn't fear a lot of things. And guys that were with him had told me as a kid that when it was time, he was very quiet. Didn't talk. He just waited for the either the jump master or whatever to, let's go. And of course it was all static line. You didn't free fall, you know, and you just held onto your pack and out you went. You know, so in Africa, he got, was it in Africa he got wounded? I think it was in Africa was where he got wounded. The one time I think he got wounded and ended up going to Germany for medical care. And if I remember correctly, I think he said the one thing that stuck in his mind was they were jumping in Africa and it was cold. And he couldn't figure that out because of course he'd never been to Africa, he'd never been anywhere, but you know, Africa, the jungle, the dead, you know, and he thought sweltering heat and everything, and he said when he remembered when they jumped it was cold. He said that's what got him was they're jumping in Africa and they're freezing to death. And he said it was like, think about that. You're going to Africa and you're freezing to death. And it's like, no, Africa, they got lions and tigers and it's a jungle and it's hot. Not in northern Africa, it's not apparently. So that was one story I remember him telling me was and out of everything, worrying about being shot, jumping out of this plane and everything, because it was at night, was freezing in Africa. The one thing that he would say about Korea is that it wasn't, for them, it didn't feel like a real war. In World War II, you had an enemy. The purpose behind fighting was to defeat them and win the war. But in Korea, there were rules that they didn't have in World War II. And that's the one thing that when he would sit with his comrades and talk, that was the one thing that was very frustrating to him it was like we went in World War II, enemy, bad guys, kill them or capture them, and you kept moving forward until the white flag come out and they surrender. That was the objective. Go from here, point A to point B, and take that ground. That's what was different, was Korea was political. And when you have men who not only fought in World War I and II in Korea, but men that fought in World War II and now are in Korea who are, for lack of a better, well, they were like bulldogs. When you get a bulldog mad and you let him go, you don't say, now just go up to the other dog and bark. You know, the bulldog attacked the other dog. Well, over in Korea, it was go so far and bark, but don't go any farther than that. We don't want to make them mad. And that's the one thing I heard not only him say, but other men that were with him and had served in Korea, and it's something that resonated all the way through Vietnam, was the people back home and in the government were worrying about making our enemies mad. It was for the first time you heard, what are we doing over there? Why are we helping another country fight their civil war? Why are our young people dying over there for their civil war? That didn't happen here. A lot of people just didn't understand. They didn't get it. My father, along with a lot of other men, they didn't have that luxury of thought. It was, those people are trying to kill us. We've got to kill them. But only so far. We can't go any further than this. And it was very frustrating. It was at that point when his thinking changed and he wanted to go into the engineers because he wanted to make the military a career. Not to me, but he did to other people that I know of that told me this. Right. Of course, being an engineer, it was a different situation because there was not going to be a lot of combat. At this point, he had high blood pressure, and they were worried that he had a heart condition. You're talking about a man who had been through 2 wars, who drank heavily, and smoked, and was very big. So, of course, tough as nails, but medically, they did not want him to go to Vietnam. Matter of fact, they denied him going to Vietnam. They turned it down. They were sending the 595th, his engineering battalion, and he went to the base commander, the general of the base, and told him, if you send my men, you send me, or you don't send my men. You have no other option. And so the general reluctantly agreed to send him. He told our next door neighbor, who was a friend of his, of course both in the military, that he knew he wasn't coming back from Vietnam and that he had to get his family situated to where they could go on without him. So he had found a house in a little town called Chapman, very quiet little town, that if he made it through Vietnam, he could sit on the riverbank with his sons and fish from his rocking chair. Our house was basically 2 blocks from the river. The house he bought. They bought a house, $11,500 for a house that was 2-bedroom upstairs, 4 bedrooms downstairs because they had the basement redone, and a bathroom downstairs. The payment was $74 a month. So he knew it would have been paid off in 1992. I found the papers. He knew that whatever happened to him, my mother would be able to make a $74 house payment. So they signed, they got everything ready. We moved to Chapman. I was in 1st grade, just started 1st grade, and when he shipped off to Vietnam. Now, he never told anybody in the family the story, but the gentleman that he told, he said that he had had a dream and that he was going to die in Vietnam, that he would not survive 3 wars and he would not come home. So, didn't tell any of this, and I didn't find this out till about, I guess it's been about 8 or 9 years ago when I came across a girl on Facebook who, that was the guy's daughter. And she said, remember me? We were next door neighbors, and told me a story about how she punched my brother because they were the same age and all that. And then she told me, this is what your dad told my father. He did not like the war in Vietnam. He did not like the era that was going on. Now we're talking about the 60s. My sister, I remember this. Little bitty fella. My dad was, this is when he went to Florida. He was gone for 90 days. And my hair grew out. I always kept it buzz cut just like his. My hair grew out, and I had a line in my forehead like this, where my sister would take a comb and do this, so my hair would come down and flip like the Beatles, right? He comes home, and he sees me, and he looked at me, and he looked at my mother, and he looked at my sister, and he said, "Not my son." Picked me up, sat me on the kitchen table, went and got the clippers, shaved my head. And I was happy because I did not, that hurt, number one, but I didn't like the hair because it wasn't like my dad's. It was probably that week, it may have been a month, I don't know, but I remember sitting in the living room there at Fort Riley, and on the black and white TV, Ed Sullivan was on. And I remember hearing, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles." My sister's going crazy. My dad is sat back in his recliner like this, and he puts his head up like this, and he watches the whole thing. Doesn't say a word. When it gets done, they go to a commercial. My dad said, "Bunch of long-haired weirdos. Let me have them for 6 weeks and I'll make them men." Put his head back, and that's all he said. That's all he said. No, and a lot of guys didn't. They drank. They drank to forget. Just like the story of him getting the Silver Star. So this happened in November 19th, 1944. So again, he's in his early 20s, 21, maybe 22 years old. He's a kid, he's a young man. This is from Major General Frederick. For gallantry in action near, and it's blacked out, and blacked out, on November 1st, 1944, Private Martin was a member of 12-man patrol on a mission to determine the strength and disposition of the enemy's position. While the patrol was en route, suddenly fired upon by enemy machine guns and rifles, and was unable to advance or withdraw in the face of intense fire. The members of the patrol jumped from the road and proceeded down a steep snow-covered slope toward another road 250 yards below. Upon reaching this road, the patrol leader discovered that several men were wounded and one man was missing. The missing soldier was seen lying in the snow about 200 yards up the hill. The patrol leader called for 2 volunteers to return for the wounded man. Private Martin and another soldier, well knowing the dangers involved, promptly volunteered, immediately left their place of comparative safety, and began the slow, tortuous climb back up the steep, snow-covered slope. On their way up the hill, they were again fired upon, and as they crawled to within a few yards of the wounded man, they saw him hit again by a burst of machine gun fire. Still determined, the 2 men crawled on and reached the soldier, dragged him down the slope, where a few minutes later he died from the many wounds he had received. Private Martin's gallant actions in attempting to save the life of a wounded comrade are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service. You see that, you can just imagine, you're being shot at, and your buddy is laying up there. He's been shot. And when they call for 2 volunteers to go get him, I can see my dad and this other guy were gone and taking off, being shot at, and climbing. I would have to say they were probably on their stomachs, crawling up, in the snow, freezing, and then they see the guy get hit with a machine gun again. But they continue up to grab him and pull him back down to the road where, later he passed away. But 19 years old, and you're being shot at with rifles and machine guns, crawling to get another one of your buddies, who I'd have to imagine is probably laying there screaming. He's been shot. I can't fathom what that would be like. What's going through your mind other than, I've got to get whoever that was and get him out of here. We got to get him. And then to see him get hit again. Okay, he got hit, and you're going right up to him. I'm probably going to die. If they can hit him, they can hit me. Doesn't matter. We're going to get him and pull him back down. It's just something you can't even really fathom that, and that's why I think a lot of people say that's the greatest generation. It's not like what our guys are going through right now in Afghanistan and in Iraq and other places. It's totally different. And God bless them, but in both cases, you're asking young men to grow up very quickly and to do something that in the back of their minds they know they're going to die. They're never going to see their mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, anything, wife, whatever. Never going to see them again. That is, I can't imagine the stress level, but that is why they did not talk about that kind of stuff. I can't imagine seeing that. In Vietnam, it was occasionally a phone call and then letters. He went over in November. So he was there November, December, January, February, March, April, May, so 8 months. So he called usually about once a month, and then he would write a letter, and of course, Mom would just tell us, your dad called, everything was fine. Because usually when he called, I think we were usually in school. It was like early morning, so it was, where he could call. The time just made it to where, we weren't at home. But Mom wouldn't have put us on the phone anyway. She wanted to talk to him.
That
So
was Daddy. That was
yeah,
her.
yeah, that was her husband. She's not talking to anybody else, and you'll see him when he comes home. Don't worry about it. When you're 6 foot, whatever he was, because the military has him at 5'7", and 2 years later he was 6'1", and he went from 167 pounds to 220 pounds.
Late growth spurt.
I guess so, but I know he was 6'4", almost 300 pounds when he went to Vietnam. My dad, I ate military food. When I was a little boy, my dad would take me on Saturdays. He would get me up, and we would go in to the mess hall, and I'd get my SOS. And as far as I'm concerned, that was the best breakfast I'd ever eaten in my life. And I couldn't wait to go every Saturday, go in and get the SOS. That was great.
It was a shareable moment with Dad, so everything tastes better.
Well, yeah, but I mean, and it was. I remember in particular the one time we went in and I got my SOS, and I ate. My dad ate. The coffee looked like it got wrung out of a mop. Strong. I mean, whew. And I remember we went from there, and I got to see an Honest John missile being tested at Fort Riley. I mean, generals and all these dignitaries were all around, and my dad, me, walked right up to the missile, and he picked me up and sat me on the missile. So what do you think of that? And I'm sitting up there on this Honest John missile like, this is cool, I'm a little kid. I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. I thought I was the king of the world, and of course people are laughing. And I remember it was painted red, white, and blue. And then when I got down, they were talking and everything, and then we went back to the side, and they gave all the specifics of what the Honest John could do and how accurate it was. And then they fired it off. And that was probably the most intense thing I've ever seen or heard or done. If you've never heard a rocket take off, especially one of that size, it literally shakes the ground. And when it hit the hills that they were firing at, of course there was no ordnance in it, but they had a marker up there and they hit it. And I mean, to watch that transport that it was on rock up and come back down, that thing took off. It was incredible. That was, that was the greatest thing about having a father in the military. The equipment that I got to see and play on was the fantasy of every other little boy who was playing Army out in the backyard, and they had their little Jeeps and their little Army men that were all or laying down or standing up, like this, the little green Army men that we had. Yeah, I got to play with this stuff. Tanks, Jeeps, half-tracks, and then all the heavy equipment. I had full reign. When I went with my dad, I could go and get and climb in any of them I wanted to and do whatever I wanted, And the guys on base were glad to take me and show me and stuff like that. It was very cool. My dad was in charge of the buffalo corral there at Fort Riley. He was the only that I know of, I keep hitting the microphone, he was the only person that I know of at that time who was allowed to kill a buffalo. Once a year, he was allowed to shoot a buffalo. They would take it to the Rod and Gun Club. He would get his backhoe and dig a big, huge pit out right beside the Rod and Gun Club. They would then bury down these, they looked like 8x8 timbers. They would stick down the ground, okay? And then they would put corrugated steel on top of that. Then they would put in, mounds and mounds of coal and wood, hickory, in there. And they'd start it. And they'd sit around it all night drinking and lying and telling tales and, all this other stuff while that stuff would burn and get ready. And then they would take a grate, this big, the wire grates, but it was about that thick. They would take one of those and they would lower it with a crane into that pit. And then whoever prepared the buffalo, it was a whole buffalo, no head, no tail, no little hooves, but everything, and they'd stuff it full of seasoning and potatoes and corn and whatever else. They'd close that thing up and they'd stick that down onto the grate, which was above the coals, and then they would cover it then with corrugated steel and put two big old pipes, about that big around, down in there, and cover it with dirt and let it smoke for 2 days. And when they pulled that buffalo out, you just walked by, they'd take the knife and just slice you off a big old piece of meat. And that was the best food I've ever put in my mouth. My dad and the other guys that I was around, because of course I was in the Rod and Gun Club where they were drinking, and later I was in the bar in Chapman where they would come and drink after they'd been discharged, and they retired. And no, they never talked about the bad times, the guys that had been shot, wounded, anybody who died, of course, they'd all, take a drink in his honor and all that kind of stuff. They wanted to talk about the good times, the fun stuff they did, the good times that they had. They did their best to block that stuff out. They did not want to talk about that. Now, my stepfather, I've got his Army slides in there. His Vietnam slides are in there. And he would show them to you. And whenever a picture would come up of who we would figure out probably died there, he'd leave the room. He didn't even want to look at the picture. Papaw, I met Papaw when I was 15.
What was his name?
John Warner Jr. He was from Walnut Ridge, Hoxie, Portia. His father was a preacher, Church God preacher in Portia, Ravenden, Black Rock. Yeah, Black Rock, in that area. Now, my mom, when my dad died, my mom stayed single, actually her whole life, but she did not date or see anybody for probably 4 years. And when she took a job tending bar, because that's the only thing she knew how to do, and then she met a gentleman who had a trucking company and a cattle ranch, and he wanted to start his own bar. They went in partners, and they started a bar called the G&M Bar and Lounge there in Chapman, Kansas. He became her, what you would call common law husband. They lived together for probably from my time in about 5th grade to the time I graduated. Papa, Mama and Papa, I met when I was 15. He was in the military, and he was doing ROTC, teaching ROTC at the time, and he got transferred to Fort Riley. Their son was my age. I became really good friends with him in high school. Mama took a shine to me because she was just like a mother to everybody. Now, my mom, she just wasn't home. She went to work at 3 o'clock and worked from 3 until midnight every day at the bar. So Mama kind of became a mother figure to me. Well, when I moved to Jonesboro, when I got out of the Air Force, in 1979, I moved in with them. I didn't have nowhere else to go. My best friend's here, so I moved in with them. And from that moment on, Papa became basically my stepfather. It wasn't a legal thing, but when he introduced me, he would introduce me to his friends as, this is my son. And when he introduced his stepson, Joe, he would say, this is my stepson. It was funny because he was also a first sergeant. He went to Vietnam. He had a military background. The difference was he was a Christian. And he got me in church with Suzanne. So I was blessed to be able to have my real father, military, discipline, and then a stepfather who spiritual and military discipline. So I was very blessed to have them both. That basically is a heart attack. That is what happened, and because, like I told you before, Suzanne's brother-in-law was in my dad's platoon over in Vietnam. So he remembers every detail of the night he died. The base where they were doing the engineering, they were clearing trees and making a landing strip for planes to come in. And they were basically building a base, getting it, ready and prepared to be occupied, So they were clearing trees and putting in the landing strip when the enemy attacked. Now, they were in what they thought was basically a demilitarized zone. It wasn't going to be, they had no intelligence saying it was going to be attacked because it wasn't even a base yet. But apparently, they probably figured out, that looks like it's going to be a base, let's get it before it becomes one, and so they attacked the base. My dad, as the first sergeant, was going from, they called them huts because they were kind of wooden tent type things. He was going to the wooden tents, getting the guys out into their foxholes. Because we're talking about engineers. We're not talking about, they weren't really combat. They weren't infantry. They were combat engineers, but I drive a dozer and I just happen to carry a gun,
His combat training
kicked in, and he went from hut to hut, pulling them out, putting them in their foxholes, and, barking orders, do this, And, of course, he was running. Shells are going off. They're firing and shooting. He's got high blood pressure, hypertension. At that time, they knew he probably had a bad heart. So when you have all that, bullets, bombs, and mortars are like not a good thing to be going off or whizzing by you if you have that. So he's running, getting everybody. When he jumps in the foxhole, he had a heart attack. It was just, that was it. They said basically they got him, when they got him, they medevaced him out, and they were doing CPR trying to keep him alive. When they got him to the field hospital, they cut him open. They basically said his heart just exploded. Suzanne's brother-in-law definitely did. They called him the Big Indian. That's what they called my dad. Either it was the Big Indian or Big Joe. And they all said if it wouldn't have been for what he did, they don't know if they would have lived through it or not. It was basically, you know, they're pretty new at what they're doing, and it was basically, you know, it was chaos. As you can imagine, even if you're highly trained, all of a sudden in the middle of the night you're getting, you know, shelled. It's, you know, holy smokes, and probably worse things than that. And, you know, you don't know, you know, do I grab my shoes? Do I shoot? Do I lay down and cry? You know, I got to do something here. And he was the one going, no, grab your gun, let's go, get in the foxhole, go, 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 go. And getting everybody where they needed to be, plus telling them, you know, protect this area, protect that area, you know. So, and that's just the kind of man, not only my father, but others. That's what they did. You know, their number one goal was to keep their men alive and protect them. And that's what they did. There was a couple, and one of them was my best friend's dad, who lived like catty corner to us on another street there in Chapman. He retired before he went to Vietnam. He retired. So yeah, his name was James Smith. No, Ralph Smith. And Mr. Smith and my dad were very close friends, very close. Oh yeah, we were, as a matter of fact, they tried to adopt me to make it easier for my mom. And we, of course, we'd have been right across the street, so, you know. But yeah, Jim and I were friends growing up all the way through high school, you know. I would go over to their house if I needed something. They'd feed me, you know, took me hunting and fishing and everything like that. So, yeah, we remained friends. It was interesting because the men automatically wanted to tell me stories, and they always wanted to tell me what a great guy my dad was. And some of the things he did, you know, getting guys out of the brig or out of the stockade, and the things that he did to help them, and how anybody below a full bird colonel, and I can remember seeing it, they would salute him first. And it was just, you know, growing up, I was like, man, I want to be just like my dad. I want that kind of respect. I want that kind of, you know, I want people to fear me and, you know, respect me and do what I tell them to do, which can never be achieved because I'm never going to go through World War II or Korea or Vietnam. So, you know, it was interesting. Men like my father are a breed that are dying very quickly. What we can learn from them, my dad was just like this. He didn't care what color you were. He didn't care what religion you were. It was about being a man of integrity or a woman of integrity and honor and respect. If you respected him, he respected you. And we can live that way today. It doesn't have to be the way it is right now. He didn't have to love you to respect you. He didn't have to agree with your politics or your religion to respect you. But he would listen to what you had to say. He would honor and respect your opinion and was willing to shake your hand afterwards. And that's the way those men were. They were not afraid to hear what someone else had to say, what you had to say, whatever it was. And they were not afraid to respect that, And I think that word probably sums up that generation, is respect.
Hello and thank you for watching Arkansas Valor presented by T-Word Media. If you or someone you know is the relative of a veteran or a veteran themselves that would like to speak to us about their service to our nation or their service abroad, we would like for you to contact us at the information below. contact@twordmedia.com. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us at Twitter for the up-to-minute information on projects that we're working on, including Arkansas Valor, and those who will be featured on our next interview. We are so proud to talk to our nation's veterans, to speak to them about their service, to speak to them about their sacrifices during wartime and during peacetime. We can never repay the debt that our veterans have given this nation, from those who have sacrificed their lives to those who have sacrificed pieces of themselves. We are eternally grateful and blessed to call you our nation's veterans. On behalf of all of us at T-Word Media, God bless you, and thank you for watching Arkansas Valor.